If you're watching this video, wherever you are right now, whether you found history to unwind through a recommendation, a late-night rabbit hole, or some unexpected corner of the internet, leave a comment and tell us how you ended up here. We genuinely love hearing from you. And if the channel is new to you, welcome. Pour yourself something warm. Settle in. This one is going to take a little while. Before we begin, if this kind of story is the reason you come here, calm, unhurried history told like a bedtime story, we'd love for you to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. No pressure, no urgency, just an open invitation. Now, close your eyes for a moment and picture a pirate. You know the image. It arrives without thinking. A black flag snapping against a gray sky, that skull grinning from the cloth, the crossbones underneath like two arms spread wide and welcome. A wooden ship, heavy and dark, cresting a wave in the moonlight. The sound of ropes pulled taut, the creak of timber, salt air. Below deck, barrels of rum. Up on the quarterdeck, a man in a long coat, wind-torn and confident, surveying the sea like he owns every inch of it. A sword at his hip, a scar at his jaw, maybe a parrot on his shoulder, maybe a map with an X on it showing the way to buried treasure. You know this pirate. We all do. He arrived in our imagination when we were children, and he never quite left. He's been everywhere. Novels, films, theme parks, Halloween costumes, breakfast cereal. He is one of the most familiar figures in all of Western storytelling, recognizable from Tokyo to Toronto, from the age of 5 to 85. But here is the thing. That pirate, the swaggering, freedom-loving, treasure-hoarding rogue of legend, is mostly fiction. And the real story, the one that actually happened on those actual ships in those actual years, is something far more strange, far more human, and in many ways far more interesting. This is the pirate we think we know. The flag, the sword, the buried treasure, but the real story is quieter and harder. Most men who turned to piracy in the early 1700s were dead before their 30th birthday. The treasure they sought was rarely gold. The sea they sailed was not the backdrop for adventure. It was a place of disease, rot, violent weather, and slow starvation. And the flags they flew, those symbols of terror and romance that have survived in our imagination for 3 centuries, most of them were nothing like the Jolly Roger you picture. So why did ordinary sailors choose a life that almost guaranteed an early death? That question is what this story is really about. Because the answer, once you understand it, changes everything about how you see these men and the world that made them. What we're going to do tonight is take the myth apart, gently. Not because the real story is disappointing. It isn't. The real story is in many ways more astonishing than the legend. What it reveals is something surprising. That among the most violent and lawless people of the early 18th century, there existed something that looked remarkably like democracy. Something that looked like justice. Something that looked, against all odds, like hope. Let's start at the beginning. The pirate mythology you carry in your head didn't arrive from one source, and it didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated over centuries. A story built in layers, each generation adding its own embellishments, until the fiction became more vivid than any fact could hope to be. The foundation was laid in 1724, when a writer who went by the name Captain Charles Johnson, probably Daniel Defoe, the same man who gave us Robinson Crusoe, published A General History of the Pirates. This book gave the world vivid, often wildly embellished accounts of Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Bonny, and dozens of others. Johnson understood what made a story sell, and he did not let factual precision stand in his way. He invented dialogue. He dramatized encounters no living witness had described. He transformed ordinary violent men into Gothic figures of almost supernatural menace. For 3 centuries, historians and storytellers alike drew from his pages, often without realizing how much was invention and how much was truth. Then came the penny dreadfuls of the early 19th century, cheap serialized fiction sold for a penny a copy, full of swashbuckling sea captains and hidden chests. Then the theatrical productions that played in London and Liverpool, turning pirate figures into crowd-pleasing stage villains and anti-heroes. The mythology compounded, and each new telling took the previous one as its source. But the moment that crystallized everything into the version we still recognize today arrived in 1883. His name was Robert Louis Stevenson. He was a Scottish author, often sick, often confined indoors, and on a rainy afternoon in the Scottish Highlands, he sat down with his stepson Lloyd and drew a map. The map showed an island. The island had a beach, a cove, a hill, and somewhere in the middle, marked clearly, an X. And from that map, a story grew. By the time it was done, the story was called Treasure Island. And when it was published in book form in November 1883, it didn't invent pirate mythology so much as crystallize it, distilling all the stories that had come before into one perfect, portable, unforgettable shape. Stevenson didn't invent the pirate myth, but he fixed it. He gave it its final form. Long John Silver, his great creation, was not a simple villain. He was charming, cunning, warm on the surface, and dangerous underneath. He had a peg leg. He had a sentimental attachment to the boy Jim Hawkins that made him, paradoxically, lovable. Stevenson drew heavily on Johnson's 1724 history, weaving real and invented details together so seamlessly that readers could not tell the difference. And they didn't try to. Treasure Island gave the world buried treasure as a pirate motif. It gave pirates their peg legs, their maps marked with X, their deserted tropical islands. The 1950 Walt Disney film adaptation added something even more durable. It gave pirates their distinctive voice. Actor Robert Newton played Long John Silver with an exaggerated West Country English accent, rolling his R's, slurring, crying, R, a theatrical choice rooted in his own regional dialect, not in any historical research. That sound, that actor's improvisation in a studio in post-war England, became the sound every pirate in every story has made ever since. It is entirely possible that pirate accent influenced our picture of what pirates sounded like. It's much less certain that any sailor in 1718 ever said R in that particular way. And the Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones, that iconic flag, it was just one of many. Pirates flew dozens of different flags, custom-made to suit their individual purposes and personalities. Bartholomew Roberts, who was arguably the most successful pirate who ever lived, flew a flag showing himself standing on two skulls, one labeled ABH for a Barbadian's head, and one labeled AMH for a Martinican's head, representing his specific personal grudge against the colonies that had hunted him. Christopher Moody flew a flag with a winged hourglass, a skeleton arm holding a dagger, and a golden skull on red ground. Blackbeard's own flag depicted a skeleton holding an hourglass in one hand and a spear pointed at a bleeding heart in the other. A very deliberate symbolic message about mortality and resistance. Each flag told a specific story. The clean, simple skull and crossbones became dominant in the popular imagination, largely because it was easy to reproduce in print, in illustration, and eventually in costume shops. But it was never the universal pirate symbol its modern ubiquity suggests. And the buried treasure, the chest of gold coins, the secret island, the map with the X, in almost all historically documented cases, pirates did not bury their treasure, they spent it. Pirates lived short, violent, itinerant lives, with no fixed address, no bank accounts, no safe deposit boxes. When they captured a ship, they took what was useful: food, medicine, rope, cloth, weapons, sugar, rum, and what was valuable they divided immediately among the crew, according to their articles of agreement. Gold, if there was any, was turned into spending money as quickly as possible, poured into port towns, taverns, and whatever brief comforts the sea gave a man time to enjoy. Burying treasure was rare in practice. The most discussed case is Captain William Kidd, who reportedly buried some of his plunder on Gardiner's Island off Long Island before his arrest in 1699. And even that cash, once recovered, turned out to be far less dramatic than the legend required. The myth of buried treasure was useful to Stevenson because it created mystery and suspense. But it was not a pirate custom. Pirates were not patient men. They did not bury their money and sail away and trust that they would one day return. So, if the story we know is mostly fiction, where did these men actually come from? And why did they choose this life? To understand why men became pirates, you have to understand what their other options were. In the early 18th century, going to sea was one of the few ways a poor man in England could earn a living. The merchant shipping industry was enormous, connecting Britain to the Caribbean, to North America, to India, to West Africa. Ships carried sugar, cotton, silk, tobacco, enslaved people, rum, salt, metal, and every other commodity that kept the British Empire functioning. Someone had to sail those ships, and that work fell to men from the lowest rungs of society, men who had few other paths forward. The work was brutal by any measure. A sailor on a merchant vessel in the early 1700s worked in something close to permanent exhaustion. He slept below decks in a hammock so close to the next man's that he could feel the warmth of a stranger's body. He ate food preserved in salt or dried so hard it had to be softened in water before it could be chewed. Hardtack, salt beef, dried peas, brined fish. He drank water stored in wooden barrels for months, often brackish, often foul, often home to things that made men sick. He worked in the cold in northern waters and choked in the heat in the tropics. He was flogged for disobedience, not theoretically, actually flogged, with a knotted rope or a cat o' nine tails in front of the entire crew. Captains on merchant vessels had near absolute power over their men. There was no grievance process. There was no appeal. Historian Jesse Lemish, writing about English maritime law in this era, argued that it was designed primarily to ensure a cheap and controllable labor force, not to protect the workers themselves. His wages might not be paid for months. In some cases, sailors returned from long voyages to find that their employers had gone bankrupt or simply refused to pay, and maritime law offered them almost nothing in return. And then there was impressment. If a merchant sailor was unfortunate enough to be near a British Royal Navy vessel in need of crew, and in wartime, that was everywhere, he could be seized on the spot. Press gangs, groups of naval officers and their hired hands, would board civilian ships, walk the docks and the taverns, raid the streets at night, and take men by force. Once taken, a pressed man had almost no right to object. He was now a sailor in His Majesty's Royal Navy, and if he tried to leave, he was a deserter, and deserters were hanged. His consent had not been asked. His life had been redirected by law. The Royal Navy, if anything, treated its men even more harshly than the merchant service. The hierarchy was rigid, punishment was savage, and the food, though nominally more reliable than on merchant ships, was prepared under conditions that would have made a modern health inspector faint. Pressed men made up a large proportion of most wartime naval crews throughout this period, and many of them spent years serving a navy they had never agreed to join. Now set that picture against what pirates were actually offering. A pirate ship in the early 18th century was, by the standards of the time, democratic, not in a loose or approximate way, in a rigorous, written, signed by everyone way. Before a pirate voyage began, the crew drafted what they called Articles of Agreement. These were written contracts governing every aspect of life on the ship. They specified how loot would be divided. They specified what punishments would be given for what offenses. And crucially, those punishments required a majority vote to carry out. They specified compensation for injury. On Bartholomew Roberts' ship, a pirate who lost a right arm in battle received 600 silver pieces. A left arm was worth 500. A right leg was worth 500. A left leg 400. An eye or a finger, 100 pieces of 8. The captain could not change these terms unilaterally. The captain could not overturn a vote. The captain served at the will of the crew and could be removed by majority decision at any time. And this actually happened on multiple ships when captains fell out of favor. The opening article of Bartholomew Roberts' code read, "Every man shall have an equal vote in the affairs of moment." This was written down in the early 1720s. The American Constitution would not be signed for another 65 years. The French Revolution would not happen for another 70. Pirates, outlaws, fugitives, men who had been pressed and beaten and cheated and discarded by their society, encoded democratic principles into their ships' constitutions almost a century before the rest of the Western world officially caught up. The quartermaster on a pirate ship was not just an officer. He was a structural check on the captain's authority. He managed the distribution of loot, adjudicated disputes, and represented the crew's interests. If the captain became tyrannical, the crew had both the right and the mechanism to remove him. The captain's word was absolute during battle. That was necessary, and everyone understood it. But outside of battle, the captain was subject to the crew, not the other way around. Colonel Benjamin Bennett, writing to the British Council of Trade and Plantations in 1718, observed with some alarm that sailors were joining pirates willingly because of the prospect of plunder and ready money, the food and the drink, the camaraderie, the democracy, equality and justice, and the promise of care for the injured. Care for the injured. On a Royal Navy ship, a man who lost his arm in battle was often simply discharged and left to beg. On a pirate ship, he received a written, contractually guaranteed payment for his sacrifice. The injury compensation articles did not exist because pirates were idealists. They existed because the men who wrote them had watched the legal maritime world treat its injured workers as disposable, and they had decided, collectively, that their own community would not do the same. This is not to romanticize piracy. What these men did was violent and illegal, and many of their victims were ordinary sailors and merchants who lost everything to pirate attacks. But the historical question, why did they turn to this life, has a clear answer that the myth is always obscured. Most of them did not become pirates because of a lust for adventure. Most of them became pirates because the legal world had offered them suffering, and the illegal one offered them something that felt by comparison like dignity. The moment that made all of it possible arrived in July 1715. A Spanish treasure fleet of 11 ships set sail from Havana, Cuba, loaded with the extracted wealth of two hemispheres: coins, silver bars, gold ingots, emeralds, pearls, and the fine goods of the colonies. The fleet carried somewhere between 14 and 30 million pesos in treasure, all of it bound for Spain. 7 days out of Cuba, the fleet sailed into a hurricane. By morning, 10 of the 11 ships had been destroyed. The wreckage and the dead were scattered across 40 miles of Florida coastline. Around 1,500 sailors perished. The treasure settled into the shallow waters off Cape Canaveral, half buried in sand. Spain immediately sent salvage crews to recover what they could, and a group of English privateers, men recently made unemployed by the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, which had consumed Europe from 1701 to 1714, heard about the wreck and acted on the opportunity. Led by a man named Henry Jennings, they raided the Spanish salvage camp and seized an estimated 250,000 pesos in silver. This was technically piracy, though. In those chaotic post-war years, the lines between legal privateering and illegal piracy were genuinely blurred. The treaty that ended the war had left thousands of skilled, experienced mariners without income. Privateers were private sailors hired by governments to attack enemy shipping during wartime. When peace was declared, the letters of marque that authorized their activities were revoked, but they were still on the sea. They still had their ships, their skills, their knowledge of Caribbean waters, and their habits of violence. Many simply continued doing what they had been doing, now without authorization. They gathered in Nassau. Nassau was the capital of the Bahamas, a port city on the island of New Providence. Its geography was almost perfectly suited for what was about to happen. The harbor was shallow enough that large Royal Navy warships couldn't enter without running aground, but deep enough for the smaller, faster sloops that pirates preferred. It sat at the intersection of major shipping routes, close to Cuba, close to the American colonies, close to the narrow passages that all transatlantic traffic had to navigate. And in the years following a Franco-Spanish attack that destroyed much of the English presence there in 1703 and again in 1706, it had no functioning government. The colonial administration had fled. The Spanish had burned what the French left standing. What remained was a small, ungoverned harbor, open to anyone who could use it. The pirates poured in. At their height, there were roughly 1,000 pirates in Nassau, outnumbering the original civilian population 10 to 1. They organized themselves loosely under what historians call the Republic of Pirates. Not a formal government, but a community bound by the shared logic of the pirate code. Benjamin Hornigold and Henry Jennings were its leading figures and its most bitter rivals. From this rough, sun-beaten town on a half-abandoned island, the most famous pirates in history launched their careers. Nassau, at the height of the Pirate Republic, would have been a disorienting place to encounter. It was, by the standards of its era, unusually diverse. A significant proportion of pirates were black men. Some had escaped enslavement, some had deserted from naval vessels, some had been taken from merchant ships and given a choice that was really no choice. When Bartholomew Roberts was finally captured and his crew arrested in 1722, roughly 65 of his approximately 275 crew members were black men, around a quarter of his total force. But here, the story requires care. The pirate world was not a clean utopia of racial equality. It was a reflection of a deeply unequal society, with all the contradictions that implies. On some ships, black sailors could vote in the ship's democracy and receive equal shares of plunder, integrated as full crew members. On others, the old hierarchies of the Atlantic world followed the men aboard. Some pirates enslaved people they captured. Some articles of agreement explicitly excluded black sailors from the rights that others held. The truth, as it tends to be, sits somewhere between the romantic version and the cynical one. The pirate world offered some black men more freedom than they could find anywhere else in the early 18th century Atlantic, and it offered others very little at all. The picture varies ship by ship, captain by captain, year by year. The Flying Gang, as Nassau's pirate community was known, included most of the names you now recognize. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, arrived here around 1716. Drawn by stories of Henry Avery's legendary sea career, Charles Vane operated from here, using the harbor as his base and the surrounding cays as his hiding places. Calico Jack Rackham built his reputation from these waters. Anne Bonny and Mary Read would pass through, and Bartholomew Roberts, who would go on to be arguably the greatest pirate the Golden Age produced, learned the rhythms of the Caribbean from men who had been trained in Nassau. For roughly a decade, Nassau was the beating heart of piracy in the Atlantic world, the motto that would eventually be given to the Bahamas by the British government that replaced the pirates: piracy expelled, commerce restored, captures the before and after with unusual economy. For those 10 years, it was commerce that was being expelled, and piracy that was very much restored. And now, the men themselves: Edward Teach, Blackbeard, the theatrical one. He was probably born around 1680 in Bristol, England, though his real name, his real face, and most of his early life are lost to history. What we know about him begins in Nassau around 1716, where he joined Benjamin Hornigold's crew. Hornigold took a liking to him, or saw something useful in him, and gave him command of one of the captured vessels. The two raided together for about a year along the American colonial coast and in the Caribbean. When Hornigold took the king's pardon in late 1717 and retired from piracy, Teach was on his own. He had by then captured a French slave ship called La Concorde, renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge, armed it with 40 guns, and assembled a crew of over 300 men. He was now one of the most formidably armed men on the Atlantic coast. What made him famous was not cruelty exactly. Historians note that Blackbeard has no verified record of murdering prisoners outside of direct combat, which is genuinely remarkable for a man of his reputation. But theater. He understood, with a kind of intuitive genius, how fear worked as a management tool. He had an enormous black beard, which he braided and tied with ribbons. Before battles, he wove slow-burning hemp fuses into that beard and lit them, surrounding his face with smoke and the smell of burning. In the early 18th century, when sailors were deeply superstitious and the boundary between the human and the demonic was something people actually thought about, a man walking out of smoke with fire in his beard was not a colorful eccentricity. It was a calculated weapon. Ships surrendered to Blackbeard not because of the violence he would commit, but because the image he had constructed made the cost of resistance seem infinite. He carried 3 braces of pistols and holsters across his chest. He wore dark coats. He moved with the deliberate confidence of a man managing his own reputation in real time. In May 1718, at the height of his power, Blackbeard blockaded the entire port of Charleston, South Carolina. He seized ships entering and leaving the harbor, took prominent citizens as hostages, and demanded a ransom that consisted not of gold, but of medicine. A chest of medical supplies, which tells you something immediate and clarifying about the real priorities of a man living on ships in the early 18th century, surrounded by scurvy and infection and the constant possibility of death by fever. Charleston paid. The hostages were released. Blackbeard sailed away. A few months later, in June 1718, the Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground at Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina. Most historians believe this was deliberate, Teach intentionally grounding his own flagship to shed most of his crew and keep a larger share of the accumulated wealth for a tighter inner circle. He accepted a pardon from the North Carolina governor, Charles Eden, who was, by most accounts, deeply corrupt and glad to accept a cut of Teach's gains in exchange for official blindness, and tried, briefly, to settle into ordinary life. He acquired a house in Bath, North Carolina. He was said to have married a woman named Mary Ormond in what would have been his 14th marriage, if the rumors were to be believed. It didn't last. When the money ran out, he went back to sea. On the evening of November 21st, 1718, a Royal Navy force under Lieutenant Robert Maynard anchored near Ocracoke Inlet, where Blackbeard was moored with a small crew. The following morning, what happened was one of the most vividly described battles of the entire Golden Age. Teach's crew opened fire. Maynard's largest sloop bore down. When the Navy boarded his vessel, Blackbeard fought with what contemporary accounts described as terrifying energy. Shot 5 times, cut with a sword a reported 20 times. Still standing until he wasn't. He died on the deck of his own ship, and his head was removed and hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's vessel, displayed as the Empire's proof of restored authority. His active career as a pirate had lasted approximately 15 months. Charles Vane, the hardliner. Where Blackbeard cultivated his image, Charles Vane cultivated pure, unadorned stubbornness. He was one of the pirates who simply refused to accept Woodes Rogers's pardon when the new governor arrived in Nassau in 1718. Where others negotiated and accepted amnesty, Vane set fire to one of his own ships and sailed it as a flaming weapon toward Rogers' fleet, then made his escape in the chaos. He was not making a principled statement. He was simply unwilling to surrender. He spent the following years operating along the American coast and in the Caribbean, capturing ships with something less than strategic brilliance, but with a determined violence that kept his men in line. Until it didn't. In November 1718, when Vane's crew encountered a French warship, Vane judged it too dangerous to attack and ordered a retreat. By the terms of the pirate code he himself had agreed to, this was cowardice, a failure of command that the crew had every right to address. They voted him off his own ship, formally deposed by a majority vote, stripped of his captaincy, put ashore in a small boat. The man who replaced him was a younger pirate named John Rackham, who wore brightly striped calico trousers and became known, inevitably, as Calico Jack. Vane spent the next 2 years evading capture, commanding smaller and smaller crews, until a shipwreck left him stranded on a Honduran island. He was picked up by a passing ship, recognized, arrested, transported to Jamaica, and hanged in March 1721. Calico Jack Rackham, the vanity captain. Rackham is, with honesty, not remembered for what he achieved. He was a moderately capable pirate, notable mostly for the distinctive wardrobe that gave him his nickname, and for the company he kept. He was not especially feared. His tactical decisions were, as his capture would demonstrate, sometimes poor. But history remembered him because in 1720, two of the people sailing on his ship were named Bonny and Mary Read. Bonny, the fierce one. She was born around 1698 in Ireland, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer and his maid. Her father eventually relocated to the American colonies, settling in South Carolina, where Anne grew up with a reputation for being fierce, quick-tempered, and unwilling to be told what she was. She married a sailor named James Bonny in 1718, against her father's wishes and at the cost of her inheritance. She and her husband made their way to Nassau, where he became an informant for Governor Rogers, and where she grew increasingly restless. She met John Rackham in Nassau in August 1720. The two of them, along with about a dozen others, including a woman named Mary Read, stole a sloop called William from Nassau Harbor during the night and set out to sea. Bonny did not disguise herself as a man for the general operation of the ship. Her crewmates knew who she was. During attacks on other vessels, she apparently dressed in men's clothing for practical reasons. She was described at her trial by a witness named Dorothy Thomas as wearing men's jackets and trousers, carrying a machete and pistol, and cursing with a directness that Thomas found memorable. Mary Read, the disguised one. Her story, as told by Charles Johnson in 1724, Calico Jack Rackham, the vanity captain. Rackham is, with honesty, not remembered for what he achieved. He was a moderately capable pirate, notable mostly for the distinctive wardrobe that gave him his nickname, and for the company he kept. He was not especially feared. His tactical decisions were, as his capture would demonstrate, sometimes poor. But history remembered him because in 1720, two of the people sailing on his ship were named Bonny and Mary Read. Bonny, the fierce one. She was born around 1698 in Ireland, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer and his maid. Her father eventually relocated to the American colonies, settling in South Carolina, where Anne grew up with a reputation for being fierce, quick-tempered, and unwilling to be told what she was. She married a sailor named James Bonny in 1718, against her father's wishes and at the cost of her inheritance. She and her husband made their way to Nassau, where he became an informant for Governor Rogers, and where she grew increasingly restless. She met John Rackham in Nassau in August 1720. The two of them, along with about a dozen others, including a woman named Mary Read, stole a sloop called William from Nassau Harbor during the night and set out to sea. Bonny did not disguise herself as a man for the general operation of the ship. Her crewmates knew who she was. During attacks on other vessels, she apparently dressed in men's clothing for practical reasons. She was described at her trial by a witness named Dorothy Thomas as wearing men's jackets and trousers, carrying a machete and pistol, and cursing with a directness that Thomas found memorable. Mary Read, the disguised one. Her story, as told by Charles Johnson in 1724, reads like something from a folk tale. Born in England around 1695, raised as a boy by her mother to claim an inheritance, spent years passing as mail, served as a soldier in Flanders, fell in love with a fellow soldier and married him, was widowed. What is documented, because the court records survive, is that Mary Read was on Rackham's ship in 1720, was known by some of her crewmates to be a woman, and was described in testimony as one of the most aggressive fighters aboard. On October 22, 1720, near Negro Point off the coast of Jamaica, Rackham's ship was caught at night by a privateer commissioned by the Jamaican authorities. What followed was not the crew's finest hour. Most accounts suggest the men hid below decks rather than fight, many of them deep in drink from a celebration earlier that night. Bonny and Read, according to the same accounts, stayed on deck with weapons drawn and shouted at their crewmates to come up and fight like men. When the crewmates did not come, Reed reportedly fired her pistol down into the hold in disgust. The ship was taken. Everyone was arrested. Rackham was tried on November 16, 1720. Found guilty and executed at Port Royal 2 days later. His body was hung in an iron cage at a place called Dead Man's Cay as a warning to passing ships. According to the account Johnson gives us, and it must always be noted that Johnson embellished freely, Anne Bonny was allowed to see Rackham one last time before his death. She reportedly told him that she was sorry to see him there, but that if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. Anne Bonny and Mary Reed were tried together on November 28, 1720. Both were found guilty. Both were condemned to death. And both, in the courtroom, spoke 2 words that saved their lives. "My lord, we plead our bellies." Both women were pregnant, and English law could not execute a pregnant woman without also executing the unborn child, which was considered unjust. Mary Reed died in prison in April 1721, most likely of fever, and was buried in the parish of St. Catherine, Jamaica. She was perhaps 26 years old. Anne Bonny's fate is less clear. Some accounts suggest she eventually returned to South Carolina, a deep fatigue that men often blamed on laziness or weakness of character rather than recognizing it as a medical emergency. Then the joints began to ache. The gums swelled and went soft and dark. Teeth loosened in their sockets. Skin bruised at the slightest touch. Old wounds, healed cuts, and sword marks from months or years past reopened of their own accord, as if the body were replaying its own history of injury. Without treatment, the internal hemorrhaging advanced, and death came typically from a sudden catastrophic bleed near the heart or brain. The remedy was simple: citrus fruit, fresh vegetables, anything containing vitamin C. But the cure was not widely understood until James Linn's formal research in the 1750s, well after the Golden Age had ended. In the early 1700s, men simply died of it, sometimes quickly, sometimes over agonizing weeks. Scurvy was one of the most significant killers at sea during this era, rivaling storms in direct combat in its toll. The historian Stephen Bound estimated that more than 2 million sailors perished from scurvy across the entire age of sail, a number that gives some sense of the scale of suffering that played out on ships during these centuries. Beyond scurvy, there was dysentery, spread through the contaminated water stored in wooden barrels in warm conditions. There was malaria and yellow fever, endemic to the tropical waters where so many pirates operated. There was typhus. There was syphilis, for which the only treatment available was mercury injections, painful, toxic, and frequently damaging in their own right. Medical instruments found on the wreck of Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge, discovered off the coast of North Carolina in 1996, include a urethral syringe for mercury treatment, forceps, surgical blades, and evidence of the rough, pragmatic medicine practiced on these ships. Surgery was performed without anesthesia. Amputation for a limb shattered by cannonball or a wound gone gangrenous, and then it ended. The end came not from a failure of piracy, but from a success of empire. By 1718, the British Crown had grown tired of the disruption. The pirates were not simply irritating, they were genuinely damaging British commerce, raising insurance rates on Atlantic shipping, strangling the Caribbean trade routes that fed the English economy. Merchant lobbying in London was persistent and effective. In January 1718, King George I appointed Woodes Rogers as Captain General and Governor-in-Chief of the Bahamas, with a mandate to close the Republic of Pirates. Rogers was, in a detail that history finds difficult to resist, a former privateer himself. He had circumnavigated the globe. He understood the sea and the men who sailed it, and he arrived in Nassau in July 1718 with a fleet of warships and 2 instruments, a royal pardon for those who would not. Many accepted. Benjamin Hornigold, who had helped build the Republic, accepted the pardon and became one of Rogers' most effective pirate hunters, pursuing his former crewmates with the particular zeal of a man who has chosen which side he's on. Hundreds of ordinary pirates took the amnesty and returned to legal lives, such as those lives could be. Rogers rebuilt Nassau's forts, restored its institutions, and slowly established British authority over the island where authority had been absent for years. But some refused. Blackbeard retreated north. Charles Vane sailed out under fire. And for those who refused, the end was visible from the moment of their refusal. Blackbeard died at Ocracoke Inlet in November 1718, his head displayed on a pike. Vane was hanged in Jamaica in 1721. Calico Jack Rackham was executed at Port Royal in November 1720. The executions were not merely punishment. They were public performances, carefully staged demonstrations of imperial authority. The bodies of executed pirates were coated in tar to slow their decay and hung in iron cages called gibbets over harbor entrances, left there for months, visible to every ship that arrived and departed. The message was written in decay. The sea belongs to us. Between 1716 and 1726, historians estimate that between 400 and 600 pirates were executed across the Atlantic world. The final act of the Golden Age came in February 1722 on the west coast of Africa. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, the disciplined machine. He was, by any objective measure, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age. He captured over 400 ships in a career that lasted roughly 3 years. Born in Wales around 1682, he was not a young man when it came to piracy. He was taken aboard a pirate ship as a prisoner, offered the choice to join or not, and accepted. He rose quickly on the basis of pure competence. He was extraordinarily capable, personally disciplined in an era when most pirates drank to excess. Roberts reportedly preferred tea. He ran his ship according to a strict code and wore elaborate theatrical clothes that he had apparently acquired from various captured prizes. On the morning of February 10, 1722, HMS Swallow, a Royal Navy warship under Captain Challenerago, found Roberts' fleet anchored off Cape Lopez, on the coast of what is now Gabon in West Africa. Many of Roberts' men were still drunk from the night before. The battle, when it came, was brief. A broadside from the Swallow raked the deck of Roberts' ship. Roberts was struck in the throat by grapeshot in the opening exchange of fire and died almost immediately. His men, following instructions he had apparently given in advance, threw his body overboard rather than allow it to be taken as a trophy. More than 250 of his crew were captured. Of those, 52 were sentenced to death in the largest piracy trial in the history of the Admiralty courts. 18 were judged guilty to the highest degree. Their bodies, after hanging, were tarred and suspended in gibbets along the African coast, swaying in the wind above the water as ships from a dozen nations passed beneath them. The Golden Age was over, not because pirates changed, not because they became less determined or less capable. It ended because empires reorganized. It ended because Britain finally committed to suppressing piracy rather than tolerating it when convenient, deployed the Royal Navy in earnest, closed the safe havens, offered pardons that split pirate communities between those who accepted and those who refused, and then hunted the remainder with increasing resources and coordination. The sea had been a space of relative freedom for about a decade. Then the walls went up, and the freedom contracted, and the men who had lived in that space were hanged or scattered or quietly absorbed back into the legal maritime world they had briefly escaped. And yet, 300 years later, we still love them. Walk through any costume shop in October, and you will find the black coats, the tricorn hats, the skull and crossbones. Open any streaming service and you will find their stories waiting. Theme parks have built entire worlds around them. Children dress as them. Adults name their sports teams after them. The word pirate has acquired so many layers of romance and adventure and rebellion that it now means something almost entirely detached from the actual men and women who lived and died under that flag. Why? Part of it is the freedom they represent. There is something in the human imagination that responds powerfully to the idea of a person who has looked at the rules and simply said no. Not the rules of some distant, abstract power, but the immediate, personal, daily rules. The rules that say you must do this work for this wage, under these conditions, and be grateful for the opportunity. Pirates, in the simplified version of the story, said no. They took their lives into their own hands. They answered to no one but the code they themselves had written. In an era when most people, certainly most poor people, had almost no control over how their days went, pirates had voted for their captain, agreed to their terms, and sailed on their own account. That is a powerful fantasy. And like all powerful fantasies, it tends to outlast the messy reality beneath it. There is also the democratic argument, which historians have taken increasingly seriously in recent decades. The pirate ships of the Golden Age were experimenting with principles of collective governance and equal representation almost a century before those principles became the formal foundation of modern democratic states. Every man had a vote. Power was checked. Injury was compensated. The captain served the crew, not the other way around. The first article of Bartholomew Roberts' code, "Every man shall have an equal vote in the affairs of moment," was written in the 1720s. The American Declaration of Independence came in 1776. The French Revolution in 1789. Pirates got there first, encoded in the articles of a stolen ship off the coast of West Africa. This did not make piracy good. It did not make the violence less real or the harm to victims less genuine. But it gives us reason to look at these men and see something beyond simple savagery. To see people who, in the process of running from an unjust world, accidentally built something worth remembering. Not a revolution, not a manifesto. Just exhausted men trying to construct a livable world on a violent sea. And finally, perhaps most importantly, pirates were human beings in an inhuman system, trying to survive. They were not heroes. They were not demons. They were sailors who had been beaten and cheated and starved and pressed into service against their will. Men who had calculated, often correctly, that the illegal life offered them something the legal one did not. They made choices that hurt other people. They made choices that hurt themselves. They lived fast, abbreviated lives and died mostly young, mostly poor, mostly forgotten. Their names surviving only because they were dramatic enough to catch a writer's attention. There is something worth sitting with in the distance between the pirate of the imagination and the pirate of history. The imaginary one is powerful, fearless, unaccountable, and free. The real one was cold, hungry, sick, and running out of time. And yet both versions carry the same essential longing, the desire to live on one's own terms, to escape the weight of a world that has decided what you are worth and found you wanting. Marcus Rediker, one of the most careful historians of Atlantic piracy, wrote that the pirates of the early 18th century were men whose lives challenged the received notions of race, class, and national belonging that the Atlantic world had built itself on. They were not fighting for an ideology. They were not radicals in the philosophical sense. They were tired men who wanted a fair wage and some say in how their days went. But what they built in the process, the written constitutions, the equal votes, the checks on concentrated power, the injury compensation clauses, was, whether they intended it or not, something the Western world would spend the next century learning to put into law. It didn't survive. The Republic of Pirates lasted about a decade. It rarely does when it arrives ahead of its time, but the record of it remains. In court documents, trial transcripts, the articles of agreement that 4 pirate ships left behind, and the faded pages of Charles Johnson's 1724 history. A reminder that the least expected people, in the least expected places, sometimes reach for something better than the world they were given. The sea is quiet now. The ships are gone. The flags have long since rotted from their poles. Nassau is a tourist destination today, and the harbor where Blackbeard's sloop once anchored now has boutique hotels and charter boats and restaurants that serve frozen drinks and pineapples. But the stories remain, and maybe that's what we're really doing when we keep telling them. when we put the Jolly Roger on our t-shirts and name our sports teams the Pirates, and let our children believe, just for a moment, that somewhere out there, the sea still belongs to the ones who sail it. Maybe we're keeping a quiet faith with the idea that the world the pirates reached for, more equal, more just, more free, is still out there, still possible, still worth wanting. The sea is quiet now, but it won't always be. If you've made it all the way to the end of this one, thank you, truly. You are exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. If you liked spending this time with us, we'd love for you to like the video. It helps more than you might think. And if you're not already subscribed to History to Unwind, the button is right there. We'll be here whenever you need a place to rest and a story to slow things down. Sleep well. We'll see you next time.